Let's please welcome Mr. Terry Tarda.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you all for being here. What we're trying to do tonight is to show kind of the conjunction of the very, very first days of the Beat Generation, and which coincided with the very first days of Chicago blues. So we're going to somehow mix this all together and have kind of a blues jam with words here and there. I'm going to read some parts out of my books which somehow seem to make sense with all of this. I do want to just, this is all very impromptu. We were going to do this in a whole other way. I was going to make grand introductions of Ned and then Slim coming in by helicopter or something, but
Excuse me, Jerry.
But we'll just have to
that way.
do it like this. But I've been rehearsing a little bit with each of them individually, and I think twice we played together, and I want to thank both of you guys. They're both brilliant musicians, and it's really been an honor and a pleasure for me. Thank you for letting me sit in with you. Most of what I'm going to be reading tonight is from my most recent book, which is called The Chronicle of Stolen Dreams. And it's really a kind of a science fiction book about a guy who hates science. It's a historical study about a man trying to escape history. It's a love story about a woman who can't find love. It's a shadowy detective story about shady detectives. And maybe most of all, it's a spiritual meditation about our need to stop meditating. One of the heroes of the story is a guy named Jackson Epsilon. And Jackson comes from the planet Obsidia, and he's on a spaceship with 6 very serious scientists, and he's really there kind of by accident, because he's essentially a hipster. He's a harmonica-playing, blues-loving guy from halfway across the universe, and they're on this mission to get energy, alternative form of energy for their planet. The spaceship has been in space for God knows eons, for an endless period of time. They've been in the blackness of space. They're all basically losing their minds, not really sure they're ever going to get to their destination. And then it all changed. On an undetermined day of a forgotten month in an unknown year, Captain Hieronymus Wombold came rushing through the observation chamber, a crazed look in his eyes. His arms swiveled like windmills, and Jackson figured he was done for, that the old man had finally lost it and was going on a wild rampage. He ducked as Wombold went rushing by, but it wasn't Jackson he was swinging at. It was the broad expanse of space to which he reached out in excitement. It lies straight ahead, there at the conjunction of the 17th coordinates. It took a moment for the crew to climb out of its catatonic stupor, but slowly the words began to sink in. They strained their eyes and saw what appeared to be a small pomegranate floating in soup in the distance. A gasp was heard, then some clearing of throats, then some peculiar sounds that had been long buried in the collective larynx of the crew, and then a cheer, but not just any cheer. It was a cheer of unbridled relief and joy, a cheer of discovery and invention, a cheer of pure exaltation and rapture. Earth! Jackson did a little jig around the control room, kicking up his heels and thrusting out his knees like a subsubian ankle dancer. Yes, 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 he kept chanting. And indeed the answer to everything was yes. Yes to life. Yes to the future. Yes to camaraderie. Yes to the mission. And yes to Captain Womble, the greatest pilot of them all. The greatest visionary. The greatest leader. Oh, how could we have ever questioned him? 3 cheers for Captain Womble. 3 cheers. Well, Captain Womble piloted the ship into progressively lower orbits until the crew had time to adjust to the outer atmosphere. But the pull of gravity proved to be more disruptive than Jackson had imagined. They'd been zooming through space with zero resistance for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be attracted to a planetary body. Flexing his hands, lifting his arms, and stretching his legs required more effort than he was used to, but that was only the beginning. Because Earth, a bombastic rock out in the middle of nowhere, was so dense that steering the rocket ship was very nearly impossible. Captain Womble, the master pilot, had to pull out every imaginable maneuver from his bag of tricks just to keep them from imploding. They were pushed, jabbed, rocked, wobbled, lashed, flailed, flogged, fustigated, and that was only in the outermost layers of the exosphere. Their descent through the thermosphere was such torture as to defy description, even by such a silver-tongued wordsmith as Jackson. How does one even begin to explain the sensation of having the enamel pulled out of your teeth, the color out of your hair, and the taste out of your tongue? My soul screams into the night. Release me, O great incandescent puppeteer. Let me soar headlong into the great unknown waves of heat and light. Let the wind baffle me to and fro. Let me set sail upon a sea of pure elemental energy. Let me expose my innermost desires, my yearnings, my untamed madness, my insatiable lust. Let me twist and turn in the firmament, carom and cruise the 9 orders of the golden sphere. The spaceship crash-landed on a mesa outside of Arapahoe, Nebraska. It was the summer of 1947. Now that summer was a truly remarkable time. Over a period of about 2 weeks, there was the Marshall Plan, the plan to rebuild Europe was announced. The Army McCarthy hearings began, where Senator Joe McCarthy from my home state of Wisconsin led his famous witch hunts and the Hollywood 10 and on and on and on. There was the Roswell UFO sightings. And if you think that those sightings have something to do with what I just read you, you may be right. There was the Hollister motorcycle riots. This was what the Wild Bunch was based on. And the riots took place on the 4th of July weekend, 1947, when the BFMC, the Booze Fighters Motorcycle Club, whose slogan was a drinking club with a motorcycle problem. They tore into this little town of Hollister, which I guess is, 100 miles down the coast or something like that. And it became this wild, it got quite exaggerated, but I actually read the news reports in the San Francisco Chronicles from 1947, and it was really the first of what was to become, motorcycle gangs and all of that stuff that we know about. And these guys, by the way, most of them had been soldiers. And in Europe, they drove Harleys. Harley was the manufacturer of all of the Army motorcycles in Europe. So when they came back, there was a large group of people that just really could not adapt to the old life that they had known in America. They couldn't go back to their father's farm or their uncle's pharmacy or whatever. They were truly kind of a new lost generation. So some of them picked up these Harleys and went off on their own world tour. And at the same time, there was a group of guys who were to become known as the Beatniks. And many of them also, including Kerouac, were ex-soldiers who had come back and were kind of wandering around, not fitting in, not knowing what to do. They couldn't adapt to that life. The CIA was formed in the summer of 1947. Network TV, for the first time, NBC broadcast across the nation. Jackie Robinson was the first black man to play professional baseball. Al Capone died of syphilis just right after being released from Alcatraz nearby here. India got independence from England, and India and Pakistan had the partition and the beginning of a terrible war. Israel got its statehood. This all happened within a period of several weeks in the summer of 1947. Now, one of these soldiers is a guy named Nick Blake. And Nick came back from the foxholes of Italy and found, and his troop transport landed in New York. Nick Blake stood on a corner in New York, debated whether to go north to Harlem, or east to the river, or west to the transit house. But something pushed him to Greenwich Village. He could wander in peace. You know, everybody was wandering. Ex-soldiers, ex-students, ex-husbands, and ex-wives. The streets were full of a disconnected population whose vacant eyes darted from doorway to doorway, searching for somewhere new to enter. A bar, or a restaurant, or a club that would suck them into its cocoon and embrace them for an hour or two. You know, everybody was walking in circles, Nick too. What else was he supposed to do? Around and around he went. His battered body had been deposited on home ground, while his friends had been buried in the mud. Why had he lived and not them? What made him so special? Was he supposed to be thankful for the chance to stare into a meaningless future? He circled Sheridan Square and Waverly Place and Bank Street on the far west side, then looped back to the center of the village to Bleecker Street and Fifth Avenue and Washington Square. Then he headed over to the Vanguard, a downtown jazz club where an atonal piano riff echoed out into the night. Inside, some way-gone cat named Thelonious Monk plunked the keys while staring aimlessly into space. What was he looking at? It was anybody's guess. His notes were upside down and either too close together or too far apart. Nothing made a bit of sense. Yet it spoke to Nick as deeply as anything he'd ever heard. It was the music of a world teetering on the edge. that had lost its way and threw out a whole new melody. Forget the old ways, it said. Forget the house and the car and the job and the degree. None of that means anything anymore. A generation has died and a new one is digging through its remains. Come on, you wild man, hep cats. Celebrate your alienation. That's what monks seem to say. Celebrate your detachment from a world that marched off a cliff. Let's toss away our music sheets and our arrangements and our tired old melodies and live in that crazy dissonance between the notes. Nick Blake headed out of New York and found himself playing with a real live Chicago blues band. And here we have a real live Chicago blues guitarist, a man that played on the south side of Chicago. He played on the north side of Chicago. He played on the west side of Chicago. He would have played on the east side of Chicago, but they don't have an east side of Chicago, which makes no sense whatsoever. They say Lake Michigan is the east side of Chicago. I grew up in Milwaukee. We got Lake Michigan. We still got an east side. I don't get it. And let out a low, plaintive wail that echoed off the walls, reverberated off the jukebox, and bounced right out the door onto Indiana Avenue. You know, little Walter had stood on that stage, and Sonny Boy Williamson too. And their sweat and tears and alcohol breath and fused right into the plywood floor that creaked every time Nick tapped his foot to the heavy 4/4 beat. A young guy named Muddy Waters held down the rhythm with his electrified steel string guitar, and his buddy Willie Dixon helped out on stand-up bass, while a succession of drummers took their turns adding embellishments that were too long, too loud, and too much on top of the beat. "Let it swizzle," said Muddy. "Ain't arithmetic we're cooking up." It was Monday night at the Flame Club, and anybody sober enough to make it up to the stage could blow a few bars or pound a few beats before Muddy gave them the hook and brought down the curtain on their musical aspirations. Solo, weaving in and out between Willie's thump-a-thump and Muddy's minor seventh thrillerations. Nick started in the lower register, bent a couple of notes down around his knees and pulled them up right into a little tight staccato package that punched out against the thick night air. He repeated a riff, then he repeated it again. And then he repeated it again. And the drummer looked up to see if he had missed a change, or if the guy had completely lost count, or if maybe he had just plain run out of ideas. But Nick's repetitive riff was the idea. Over and over he played it, changing only slightly the pitch and timbre until it finally drilled itself right into the head, and pulling at the nodes and synapses of the brain and snapping them back like strands of thick licorice. played a quick unison riff on guitar. And Willie joined in, and then the three of them hit the notes all at once, and their feet moved forward together in a little subliminal strut, which announced the groove was on. Oh yeah. I have no idea how long any of this is taking. We had kind of worked out, I don't know how much. I'm just gonna jump around, and guys, I'm gonna skip the next part because it's gonna never get done. And Nick and Esmeralda wound up leaving Chicago, and they got into a 1947 Hudson convertible. And this Hudson convertible, which by the way was very similar to the convertible that Kerouac drove across the country, they were driving along and they turned on the radio. They had one of the first car radios in 1947. And what they heard was a station that came out of Helena, Arkansas called KFFA 1360 on the AM dial. Actually, I don't think they had an FM dial yet, but anyway. And it was the King Biscuit Hour. Actually, it was only 15 minutes because King Biscuit were the sponsors of a show of live blues that went from exactly noon until 12:15 in the afternoon, because that's when the plantation workers got off for their lunch, their 15-minute lunch. And this station had hired some blues musicians, and sure enough, every day, exactly at noon, they would play live blues, and every radio owned by every black person in the South was tuned into KFFA. Well, one day, a young fellow named Rice Miller from Biloxi, Mississippi, came in and started playing harmonica. And the DJ said, boy, this guy's pretty good. I think we're gonna add him to the band. So that day they had their first performance, and they announced him as, ladies and gentlemen, Sonny Boy Williamson. What? His name was Rice Miller. But you see, the DJ figured if Sonny Boy Williamson was on the show, they could really get a lot of popularity. So this went on for a while until the real Sonny Boy Williamson, who was in Chicago, got wind of what was happening. But Rice Miller was not to be messed with. Rice Miller went back to Mississippi and paid somebody off, and got them to give him a new birth certificate, which not only said Sonny Boy Williamson, but made him 10 years older than the real Sonny Boy Williamson. So this led to incredible confusion, needless to say. And if you ever pick up an album, you'll now see Sonny Boy Williamson 1 and Sonny Boy Williamson 2. And even though Sonny Boy Williamson 2 was a bit of an imposter, he's actually the better player of the two. And so as we're driving in our Hudson, listening to the radio, we're going to play one of Sonny Boy Williamson's tunes, which is called 9 Below Zero.
Ain't it a pity? People, ain't it a crying shame? Ain't it a pity? People, ain't it a crying shame? Yeah, you know it 9 below zero, and that woman left it for another man. I give her all my money, all my love and everything. All my money, all my love and everything. Yeah, you know it 9 below zero, and that fool put me down for another man. Come on, Terry. She lied to me. That woman didn't tell me everything. She lied to me. That woman didn't tell me everything. Yeah, you know it 9 below zero, and that fool put me down for a man. Rather be out on the delta, sleeping out in the falling rain. I'd rather be way out in the delta, sleeping out in the falling rain. You know it's 9 below zero, and that love don't mean a thing. Come on, let's take it home, man.
above the plains of Nebraska, a crow climbed into the steady funnel of wind, then glided aimlessly over the barren terrain in search of a berry bush or a stray gopher or even a baby sparrow if things got really desperate. You know, Nebraska was for amateurs, not for big black flappers who could plan, connive, and soar with the best of them. This was a crow out of his element, a city crow stuck amongst country bumpkins, a bird whose multitude of talents was being wasted by an unappreciative audience of dull farmers and backwards birds. But the crow sensed a kindred spirit in the car below. Esmeralda's hair was like a big black nest that blew every which way in the wind. Next to her, Nick pulled out his harmonica and played to the rhythms of the tires clacking on the asphalt. There was something about the movement of the car that pushed the music itself. He cupped his free hand around the metal casing and formed a vacuum that acted like an echo chamber. He bent the reeds with this thin stream of air that started deep in his larynx, rose up his throat, and crested at his lips. Then hit a high note that called to the heavens, sang to the clouds, and warbled to the birds above. Jackson and Nick found themselves in Peterson's Pool Hall on the corner of 15th Street and Glen Arm in Denver. There was a couple of young guys playing pool. One of them, his name was Neil Cassidy. The other one was Jack Kerouac. Kerouac had just taken a bus, a Greyhound bus, from Lowell, Massachusetts. It was his first time ever leaving the East Coast. And he went to visit his buddy Neil in Denver. Well, Jackson looked at this manuscript that Kerouac was writing. It was something called The Town and the City. Hadn't been published yet. It was a good book. It was a pretty good book. It was like a book. It was a book like everybody wrote in those days. It was a book. Jackson said, well, yeah, that's a good book. I like that book. It's a good book. This is coming from an outer space man from Obsidia. Literary critic, no less. Kerouac got a little irritated, maybe. He was looking out the window, and this is kind of how I imagine what he might have said. Look out that window. Look at those mountains. It's the mountains of America stretching to the lakes and deserts. It's a jazzy bebop riff of undulating crests and valleys. An endless horizon that rises and falls to the beat of the universe. I tell you, man, I can hear it. I can hear saxophones in those mountains. Bop-de-bop, they're off on a wild solo, tossing boulders off the peaks. Big volcanic explosions burning red hot and sizzling. It's the rhythm of nature itself. It's the flow of rivers bursting from their banks. It's the mist of clouds hanging low in the sky. It's the breath of air so fresh it will burst your lungs. It's a long, vibrating, pulsating, trembling solo that shakes the rafters and eats right into the soul and pulls us along, every one of us. It pulls us down a jaggy, jazzy road and drops us off on a precipice that looks out past life and death and into the womb of eternity itself. Listened when Jackson said, "That's a good book you got, but you should write the way you just spoke. That's the way you should write, straight from the soul, from what you're feeling." Kerouac looked at him and said, "Oh yeah? That's the way you want me to write?" And Jackson from Obsidian said, "Yeah, man. Real loose." Well, Town and Country got published to not much acclaim, but Kerouac had that voice in his ear from that crazy guy in Peterson's pool hall. And he decided, maybe I'll write about that road trip I'm on instead. That thing about being on the road, from Lowell, Massachusetts to Denver, and maybe I'll write something like that. We'll see if that works. Well, our heroes arrive in San Francisco. We got Jackson from Obsidian, and we got Nick, the soldier. And they show up in North Beach, summer of 1947. And there wasn't a whole lot happening. There was a couple of jazz clubs down on Broadway. And there was a little club over here here on Jackson Street, just opening up. And this guy named Big Daddy Nord, who was 6'7" and weighed about 300 pounds, was opening up a club down in the basement. And one day, he was painting the sign, and he's painting Hungry Id, because it's 1947 and it's Freud, right? He could have called it the Hungry Ego or the Hungry Superego, but he decided he was going to call it the Hungry Id. But he ran out of paint. So he had Hungry Eye written up on that board, and somebody came by and said, well, you know, Big Daddy, I think that's a better name anyway. So Big Daddy Nord opened up the Hungry Eye. Now this is before Woody Allen got there, before Barbra Streisand, and before most of these people. But that was the very, very, very beginnings of North Beach as we know it. And Jackson wound up fulfilling his dream.
Oh, excuse me.
Jackson wound up playing on the stage of the Hungry Eye. Shall we try this as a slow blues? In E? I have no idea what we're doing.
Excellent.
Good.
Yeah.
The stage was wet with sweat and packed from one brick wall to the other with musicians, instruments, amplifiers, and empty pitchers of beer. These were afternoon blues cats who made up their rules on the spot, and it was survival of the fittest. You want to play? Sure, jump right in, but it better be good, baby. You got one run through the changes and then it's goodbye, sucker, back to the woodshed. But let's see what you got inside. Maybe you got lucky and you hit a couple of clean notes, but clean is clean and dirty is dirty. And this is the blues, baby. We're gonna hang you out to dry. Go ahead, tell us your story. We'll listen until you start repeating yourself. But then it's the hook, Rook. And don't be coming back for more. black crow flies on Sunday, not just any day. So you better look out, people. The black crow is coming this way. I'm 10,000 miles from nowhere, 20 light years from home. I'm 10,000 miles from nowhere, 20 light years from home. Won't somebody help me? I got nowhere to call my own. Oh, the nightlife, baby, there's nothing like it. Okay, well that's it for Ned. Thanks for Ned. Ned has another date tonight. I think he actually gets him some money. So that's where his loyalties are. But Slim and I are gonna hang in for a few more minutes. Yeah.
How about it for Terry, everybody? How about it for Terry? And Mary.
Now, some of you might know, have seen a guy named Bernard in the neighborhood. I haven't seen Bernard for a while, actually. But Bernard was about 4 feet tall, and he didn't speak, and he couldn't hear. But he always had a nice pair of pants on, and really clean sneakers. So somehow I kind of liked Bernard. And it seemed like every day that I would go out, I'd hear in the background, ack, ack. And there was Bernard with his hand out. So I, of course, reach into my pocket and come up with a quarter. And I'd hand him the quarter. And Bernard would give me a Nazi salute. What was that all about? I had no idea. But this went on day after day. Every day, I'd hear Bernard come in. I'd give him a quarter. I'd get the Nazi salute, and off he would go. But one day, I reached into my pocket, and all I had was 2 dimes and a nickel. So I gave it to Bernard, and he looked in his palm, and he took that money and he threw it on the street. And I said, "Hey man, fuck you! That's 25 cents, it's the same." But no, Bernard went running off, would not accept my 2 dimes and a nickel. Well, I decided to follow him. This is a section from my book called The 1,000-Year Journey of Tobias Parker. Bernard passes a florist shop and stops to inspect his reflection in the window. He vaguely remembers boarding a freighter some years ago and sailing out of Hong Kong harbor for parts unknown. It was one of those big container ships with stacks and stacks of identical, hermetically sealed containers and precious few crewmen. Was Bernard one of those crewmen? Maybe a ship's mate? Maybe he was the captain, who knows? He doesn't remember. All he knows is that he had an old monocle he bought in a Kowloon antique shop, and a fresh change of clothes from one of those big department stores on Nathan Road. And the only reason he even knows that is because that monocle is still tied around his neck, and he's been wearing those clothes ever since. Well, Bernard sees his reflection superimposed on a bromeliad inside the flower shop, and he imagines himself swinging from vine to vine in a tropical jungle. He looks for all the world like Tarzan with a monocle. "Ack! Ack!" he calls to his reflection in the window. "Ack! Ack!" the reflection calls back. Next on his rounds is Tosca, a neighborhood saloon and Hollywood hangout that Bernard frequents from time to time. The top of Bernard's head and the bottom of the bar are exactly the same height, which allows him to move unseen and unimpeded through the darkened recesses of the room. Nobody seems to notice him or to care that he's there, which is fine because Bernard doesn't have any idea that he's rubbing knees with Sean Penn and Sam Shepard and Nicolas Cage and all those other exiles from the studios down south. They're there to escape the public eye, but he likes the 1940s feel of the place and imagines himself as some handsome anti-hero from an old Chinese film noir. In the movie, in his mind, he saunters inside, lights a match with one hand, and takes a deep drag of a mentholated Kool-Aid. A waitress walks by, her legs stretching to the sky like the limbs of a banyan tree. She glances at the handsome man with the monocle in his eye. Bernard flashes her a chop suey smile. Bernard's movie fades to black and he heads next door to Specs, an old beatnik hangout that invariably lures him inside. The joint is crammed with an array of South Pacific masks. A bunch of junk, really. The kind of stuff that has no value to collectors, but they remind Bernard of a childhood that has been otherwise erased from memory. Is he the son of a Sulawesi headhunter left by accident on the coast of the South China Sea? Is he the last of a long line of Mongolian tomb robbers abandoned along the ancient trade routes? Is he the descendant of a race of master woodcarvers exiled to the barren deserts of Central Asia? You know, Kerouac once stared at those masks, and Ginsberg, and Corso too. But Bernard has never heard of any of them and would be unimpressed if he had. Bernard has no interest in the spoken word, since the only thing he can hear is a kind of odd cooing inside his own head. The corner of Broadway is a place that changed hands so often, Bernard passes by just to see what's there today. It's been a bank, a restaurant, a bar, a dance club. That was just last week. He figures it's good, this constant change. It keeps the blood circulating. And circulating is what it's all about for Bernard. Circulating the neighborhood, circulating through the bars, circulating through the endless nooks and crannies as he tries to remember exactly what it is he's looking for. Well, somebody finally gave Bernard a quarter. and he walks down Broadway as fast as his small feet and short legs will take him. He flips that quarter between his fingers, feeling the embossed image of George Washington on one side and the outstretched wings of an eagle on the other. He passes a tobacco shop, a taqueria, and a pizza joint. And then he picks up his pace past a newsstand, a Tunisian kebabery, and a video shop. And he finally stops when he feels the warm glow of 500 flashing light bulbs on his skin. As he steps up to the window of the Lusty Lady's strip shop, he drops his coin into the slot and slowly raises his arm in a Nazi salute. So that's where all of my quarters have been going. For a peep show. Oh, Bernard, Bernard, Bernard. I will never deny you a quarter again. That was North Beach, I guess about 30 years ago. I had come back from 8 years traveling around, and we were talking about this connection of the early days of the beat movement, Kerouac and Cassidy. I moved here originally in 1969, and they had both died. I think it was in 1967. But there was a transition period because Ken Kesey came along with a bus called Further, and Cassidy, who of course had been driving on the road and driving to Mexico and God knows everywhere else, Cassidy hooked up with Kesey, and they took the bus further to New York on what was called the electric Kool-Aid acid test. And then they came back, and then Cassidy died shortly after that. And then there was another transition. A guy named Wavy Gravy, who was an East Coast poet. I actually saw Wavy Gravy before he was Wavy Gravy, when he was Hugh Romney, which is his actual name. I was a student at the University of Wisconsin. It must have been about 1966 or so. And Hugh Romney came walking into the student union dressed as a general. Completely perfect. Everything was perfect, perfect, perfect. A little scary, you know. None of us were very much interested in the military. But there was one odd thing in his uniform. His hat had some kind of a crazy B-52 flying out of the top. And on this name tag it said, General Waste More Land, which some of you will remember. General Westmoreland was the head of the military adventure in Vietnam. So anyway, this guy Hugh Romney was going around from campus to campus as General Waste More Land. And then he found himself one day at a blues concert, and I guess he was kind of lying on the stage up at the front, and B.B. King was tuning up his guitar, getting ready to play, and he looks at this white kid down there, and he said, "Hey, you know, you look like Wavy Gravy." And Hugh Romney said, "Hell, that's a good name." So that's how Hugh Romney became Wavy Gravy. And Wavy hooked up with Kesey, and then Wavy went to Europe. He went to Amsterdam and got his own bus. And this was a bus that was a group called the Hog Farm. And this bus went all the way through Europe, through the east and ultimately wound up in Kathmandu. So this is kind of on the road, but taken further. This is the genesis. This is what started in, as I said, in 1947. It went through Kerouac, it went through Kesey, it went through Wavy Gravy, and fell to some of us who found ourselves following the road of Henry Miller, Jack Kerouac, I wound up in Amsterdam, and that's the first time I started playing music publicly. Now, I traveled for 8 years, and I gathered various things in different places, but there's one thing I still have from my years of traveling, which I brought to show you. This is a little tin can from Panther Cigars. It's a Dutch cigar tin. And I discovered somewhere along the line that I could fit 9 harmonicas absolutely perfectly in this little can. And this can has been with me, I guess, 1.5 times around the world, through Africa, India, God knows, every other place. Along the way, I got a decal of Shiva, and a decal of Durga, and an Om symbol, and on the inside, a decal of Buddha, and an ostrich feather. Because I guess one day I figured, I need an ostrich feather in my harmonica box. So this is the one thing that I still have from that journey, and it is my most valuable possession. I went from Amsterdam to Stockholm. Maybe you could play some slow boogie here or something in A. And played with a blues band. And I was staying with a woman named Sophie Olsen. Really nice woman. She was very generous and offered me a spare bedroom. What the hell is a spare bedroom, by the way? I mean, people are living on the streets. It's a spare bedroom. Anyway. Now, Sophie had one odd, I guess you'd call it a hobby. She had a pet boa constrictor. Now, I just absolutely hated snakes. And here we were in the winter in Stockholm, and the snake is pretty sleepy. But every Friday, Sophie would come home with this little Chinese takeout cart. And she'd come through the door and she'd say, "Frederick, it's Friday." And Frederick would kind of slowly awaken, and Sophie would go over to the cage and take the top off, and she would turn the carton upside down, and a little live mouse would come tumbling out. And the mouse would start walking around, not really knowing anything, not recognizing that he was in terrible trouble. But he was just kind of walking around with his eyes, hey, what's up, man? There was a little leaf over there, he checked out the leaf, there was a little twig over there, and then there are these 2 eyes of Frederick slowly getting larger. Well, I was rooting for the little guy, but it was pointless. There was no way. And sure enough, it was only a matter of time before, flap! Frederick grabbed the mouse with his teeth, spun his body around him, constricted him, squeezed squeezed the shit out of him, and then slowly started to ingest him. The front feet first, then the head, then the body, slowly through this reticulated jaw, until at the end there was nothing left but the tail of the mouse. And I swear it looked like an after-dinner cigarette. Well, one day, Sophie came to me and said, "Oh, Terry, I have some news." And I said, "Well, yeah. Frederick is gone." I said, "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "Well, the lid of the case is gone, and Frederick has disappeared." And I left.
Yeah, right.
That was it for me. And one thing led to another. And don't ask me how, but I soon found myself at the airport in Nairobi. And a taxi driver came up and said, "Where do you want to go, sir?" "Bwana," he called me. He called me Bwana. And I said, "Take me to the snake park, because I want to meet my enemy." So he took me to the Nairobi Snake Park, and I saw a big cage, python, it said, 30 feet long. And it had a little statistic on the side that said, last year in Kenya, there were 16 python bites of human beings. And there were 16 deaths. Ooh. So I walked over to the next case and saw a puff adder. Puff adder's a real lazy snake. It doesn't move out of the way. If you happen to be walking through the bush one night and you step on a puff adder, your ass is grass. Last year there was 27 puff adder bites. 27 people died. Oh man. I go to the next cage, black mamba. Now this snake jumps up about midway and then bites you in the middle around your stomach, so there's nowhere to put a tourniquet. This snake, you've got 3 minutes to live when it bites you. This is the deadliest snake in the world. Last year in Kenya, there was 42 bites. 42 people died. I got back to the taxi and I said, "Take me to the airport." But he said, "No, Bwana. No one gets bit in Nairobi." I wound up staying in Kenya for about a year. Let's have that boogie again. And I found myself on the coast, up from Mombasa, on a real old bus. a dirt track. Because of the monsoon, the road was a series of endless potholes, with whole sections washed away. As we pushed further from Malindi, the Western-style clothing of the city gave way to customary dress, and it seemed like we were traveling back in time. A woman with 8 inches of metal rings around her neck sat next to me for a while. Then came a man with ochre and beads matted into his hair. And later, an old lady with earlobes that stretched to her shoulders. And about halfway to Garson, 100 miles due north and slightly in from the coast, the driver jumped off the bus, bought a little bundle of what looked like tree bark, and began voraciously chewing it. The old lady sitting next to me giggled when I pointed at the bundle, then opened her eyes wide into a trance-like stare and said, "Cut." The driver shoved a big wad into his mouth, jumped down, and seemed to get energized for the next leg of the journey. Started getting real energized. As we came barreling around a curve in the road, he saw a family of baboons and did what any red-blooded, amphetamine-crazed guy behind the wheel would do. He tried to run them down. Suddenly, we're flying down the road. He's got his pedal to the metal. The baboons are tearing ass ahead of us, turning back with these big red eyes and enormous fangs and shrieking like crazy, and suddenly we're up on the bank of the road trying to nail one of these 100-pound blurs of fury. And this guy is nuts. Nuts. The bus is shaking and creaking. Some man with a bone through his nose is stomping on the aisle across from me. A kid is leaning out a window trying to grab a mango off a tree. The baboons are really getting crazy now, but not as crazy as the driver, who's chewing the cat and having mad ancestral visions as he bears down on the animals. And suddenly I hear a clunk. And then I hear a clunk, clunk, clunk. And oh shit, he fucking hit one. Stand this. The baboons are completely freaking out, running up the hills, climbing up the trees, rushing, leaping into the bush, and then all of a sudden, just like that, we're back on the road, The driver's yawning. The guy across the aisle is totally sound asleep. The kid is munching on a mango. And it's like absolutely nothing ever happened. That bus went up to this little island where I spent 7 months called Lamu. And just last week, Al-Shabaab, the Somali terrorist group, shot up a town just a few miles from there and killed, I think, 45 people or something. It's really shocking to me. I mean, Lamu was actually, when I was there in the early 70s, was known as the Mecca of Africa. It was a very holy island, actually. There were 22 mosques on this little tiny island and 66 whorehouses. Or the other way around. Nobody could ever seem to know which was which. But it was very mellow. It was all, you know, they were all Muslim and kind of serious in a way, but in a way they weren't serious at all. And it was one of the mellowest places I've ever been in my life. It's just shocking to me, you know, to think of the terrorists have taken over much of the island and much of that area. But, you know, things have changed. I think I'm just gonna read. Okay. Slim is
I got somebody waiting on me.
Slim is a bluesman.
Got to go.
I'm going to finish with one last piece about India. Which still vaguely has something to do with music. I wound up in the Himalayas at one point, and one morning I was in Manali, which is this little town that lies between two very steep mountain ranges. There was something magical in the air. The sky was crystal clear, the snow-capped mountains loomed majestically above, and a path seemed to beckon me into the woods. I thought I heard flutes in the distance, and was certain my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I continued on, the sounds became clearer. They were flutes, all right, and sprightly flutes at that. I wandered off the path, came upon a clearing in the woods, and stood there a moment, unsure of myself. Finally, I pulled back a branch and saw sitting in a large circle 20 Tibetans. I'd heard there were Tibetan refugees in the area, and finally I was actually seeing them. Now, the first thing I noticed about Tibetans was that they didn't sit in very orderly circles. In fact, to call it a circle at all was stretching it a bit. It was more of an unruly squiggle that vaguely connected as it curved around. The next thing I noticed about Tibetans was that they didn't really sit in the classic meditation position. In fact, their posture was much closer to what I'd call a sprawl. And the third thing I noticed about the Tibetans was that they seemed to have a fondness for a milky white liquid that was being ladled out by the only woman in the group. And as they sipped from large bowls, I began to get the suspicion that, hey, they were dead drunk. And not just drunk. No, these, my very first Tibetans, the most spiritual of all people, were knocking back one shot of chung after another and were rip-roaring 3 sheets to the wind, fucked up. I couldn't remember reading about this in my Buddhism course back at the University of Wisconsin. Then they noticed me. Come, come, sit here in the honored spot next to our patriarch, they seemed to be saying. So I followed their welcoming waves, crossed the clearing, and approached the old wise man. He smiled at me, motioned for me to sit, and then as I began to kneel down, he grabbed my balls. Whoa, Kimosabe! This definitely wasn't in that Buddhism course. Or was it? I remembered how I didn't understand a lot of the terminology. Twists! Twists! Someone started chanting while pointing my way. Hey, who do you think you're calling a twist? I was about to say, but then I began wondering, what exactly is a twist? Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it's their greatest honor, like Great White Man from across the many oceans. They all started yelling, "Twist! Twist!" until some red-faced guy pulled me right to the center of the clearing. In a way, that wasn't so bad. I was glad to be away from the ball-grabbing wise man. But just what the heck was I supposed to do now? Then the guy started moving his arms back and forth real stiff-like and shaking his hips and moving his feet. And he's like, "Oh no, a Tibetan chubby checker. You want me to twist?" A big roar of approval erupted. "Twist! Twist!" They kept yelling, and suddenly we're all on our feet and we're doing some insane dance to a happy flute. They're pouring chung down my throat, the vilest, most potent hooch this side of the Ozarks. And we're all floating around the dance floor like drunken egrets. Everyone's arms were outstretched, and almost imperceptibly the Tibetans began flapping them like wings. Their heads bobbed up and down, their knees bent slightly, and then the flapping increased a little. Me right along with them. Me and 20 Tibetans and a woman whose father had just died. And we're flapping his spirit away. We're drinking to his memory. We're dancing to the good old days. We're flapping and floating and flying at 10,000 feet. And I'm starting to really like my first Tibetans. They've got a certain style. And I'm warming up to the idea that come what may, we're going to twist again, like we did last summer.